Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime.
World Jam Global.
Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Back in the day, I didn't really care about the system. It was all about survival. It was do or die. I had too many rivals. I was too young and foolish to stay in school. I learned my lessons in the streets. There was not a man I couldn't beat. I was good with my hands and very quick on my feet. I was swimming in women. I had girls all over the street. I was getting money. Life was so sweet.
I want to say a big good evening going out to each and everybody listening right across the globe.
I'm a change.
It's Saturday night. It's 6 o'clock. And it's time for Issues Today on World Jam Global Radio.
In jail, trying to cope with this living.
I've got my special guest, former Chief of Police Jerry Summers, who I'll be introducing very shortly.
Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Did my time. I paid for my crime. I was a drug dealer, sold more drugs than Superfly, but I never got home.
Yes, you are live on World Jam Global Radio, and for those of you that are just locking in and locking on,
I had to repent, I must admit.
You'll find us on www.worldjamglobalradio.com.
And think it over since I've gotten older.
Or you can follow us on TuneIn.
Again, I was young. Done. My brain was so numb.
We are live on World Jam Global.
Nobody's chump. Me and Billy the Kid had a lot in common. I was the real Terminator, much meaner than Arnold Schwarzenegger. I'd chew you up and spit you out like a real alligator, especially all you haters.
Oh, these technical things, they do get on my nerves sometimes. You are getting a slight interference as this track plays, but I think it's because I've got another app running on my computer at the same time. So no, it's not your end, it's my end. We'll have it resolved by next week, I promise. Don't forget, in the meantime, you can follow me again on tomorrow morning for my Wake Up Everybody Sunday Gospel Show, which will be going out live at 8 a.m. GMT. And bearing in mind that there is no issues today next Saturday night. And that's because it's my daughter's birthday and I'm going to be busy. She's booked me as a DJ, by the way.
I paid for my crime.
Good gosh.
Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Try to get this.
You know what I'm going to do? I think we've gone as far as we can go with this track. I really can't. I can't go on any longer with that because for me it is making too much of a noise. And I know why it is. But anyhow, you are in tune with Kervin Julien on Issues Today on World Jam Global Radio. And my special guest is none other than former Chief of Police, Jerry Summers. Jerry, are you there?
I am indeed.
Oh, I was getting this. One of my laptops was broken down, so I was trying to get the World Jam website up live.
World Jam Global.
And what it actually did was it started to interrupt with the track that was playing. So I've had to turn that off, and we're going to go live straight to you. And first of all, Jerry, why don't you tell the audience just a little bit about yourself, who you are, and what you've done, and why we're here today.
I'm delighted to. Kervin, first of all, thank you so much for having me on. I consider it an honor to be on the radio station with you, especially live for your audience. So thank you very much. My background is fairly diverse. I have an undergraduate degree in pastoral ministries, and I have a master's degree in MBA from the University of Liverpool in the United Kingdom. I'm also an author, speaker, trainer, coach, and community activist. My book is Tarnishing of the Badge, and my activism falls under a company that we are launching as an exclusive on your radio station today called Let's Make It Matter, and it can be found at letsmakeitmatter.com.
Wow.
Let me give you a little bit of my background. I went into law enforcement from a career in banking. I left Citibank in California and moved to Idaho. I wound up being a bivocational pastor, and I was also supervising the juvenile detention facility for the county. I then left and went to work for the police department in a small but very active resort community that swells from about 3,000 steady population anywhere to 50 or 60,000 during the summer and winter months. It's a resort town. I went into law enforcement and initially from the detention center and was the code enforcement officer, which is a non-sworn position. It's really the animal control officer and parking enforcement. I did that for about a year. Went into the academy, went to the patrol division. From the patrol division, I spent a year there, went to school resource officer. From school resource officer, I then went into detectives. From the detectives, I wound up being the supervisor or the sergeant of the detective division for 3 years, and then I transferred back over to patrol as a patrol sergeant, at which time there was a major shakeup in the police department. The chief, the lieutenant, and the other sergeant all got crossways and wound up having to resign due to an evidence handling procedures and ethics violations. And I was left as the only remaining supervisor of the department at that time, was asked to step in as the interim chief of police, which I did. And 6 months later, after a nationwide search, I was selected as the chief of police. I immediately that was in 2005. I immediately went to work in changing the reputation. And what I did is I based a lot of my changes on the dissertation I wrote, or was preparing to write for the University of Liverpool. And in 2011, I presented a dissertation entitled Law Enforcement Decertification, Shifting the Paradigms of Ethics, Morality, and Politics from Law Enforcement's Traditional Approach to a Resource-Based View. Now, a resource-based view, for those that don't know, simply is putting people in the right place and training them for the position to maximize a competitive advantage over other organizations that you compete with, which is what we proceeded to do. There's some valid case law that you'll find that is important, and that you find that in the U.S. Supreme Court case Mapp versus Ohio, which is a Fourth Amendment violation, and it talks about the exclusionary rule, and Brady versus Maryland, which Mapp versus Ohio was a 1961 case, and Brady versus Maryland is a 1963 case, which says exculpatory evidence or evidence that's beneficial to the accused must be disclosed to defense counsel, and due process also requires fairness in all legal matters. That was the impetus of the book that I wrote, Tarnishing of the Badge, in which I point out several flaws in the thinking or the traditional approach of law enforcement and call for the changing of it that demands for a higher transparency and disclosure that we're finding in the United States is reluctant for organizations, especially law enforcement organizations, to follow. And one of the things that the people must understand, that the power to implement change in any government entity has always rested with the citizens. The only fear and complacency is what stands in its way. And I understand full well the public's lack of tolerance for those advocating ethical change and individual officer accountability while concurrently supporting the thin blue line mentality or the code of silence that you find in law enforcement. After all, I was forced into retirement for holding a high-ranking political official accountable for the laws the average citizen must follow, and it cost me my career, it cost me a lot of friendships, and it cost me a larger portion of my retirement. but it also opened my eyes to the dilemma that most people are facing because of our government and our law enforcement's unwillingness to self-police. And self-police without transparency never works, regardless of the industry. And the examples you see that are the Enron, you see Comcast ethical violations, and you see in 2008 the United States banking crisis, where the entire financial system was held together by a thin thread of trust, and it almost destroyed the entire system. So without this transparency, what we see every day as examples in our judicial system is officers withholding evidence, prosecutors failing to disclose evidence to the defense counsel, and judges refusing to hold them accountable for their actions, which is incredibly disappointing in a system of justice where the public's trust and in checks and balances is established within the system itself. Therefore, the integrity of those involved is supposed to be and must always be above reproach. Ultimate trust is bestowed upon police officers who enforce the laws, the attorneys who handle cases, and the courts who hear and pronounce judgment. In a system where over 97% of the cases are concluded without going to trial, it becomes critical for the process that those involved with such high standings must be above suspicion in their professional morals and integrity. And unfortunately for the accused, just a cursory view of the United States Supreme Court records reveals this is not the case. It's a process, in my opinion, with a systematic integrity problem that's bordering on moral failure, and it's preventable and unnecessary.
Okay, so here's a question for you, Jerry. You know, when an officer joins the force, it's almost he has to swear an oath, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, what is that oath?
The oath is the Law Enforcement Code of Ethics, and if I'll summarize it briefly, the fundamental duty of a law enforcement officer is to serve the community and to safeguard lives, property, and protect the innocent against deception, the weak against oppression or intimidation, and the peaceful against violence or disorder. And it's to respect the Constitution, the constitutional rights of all, to liberty, equality, and justice. The officer's personal and official life must be kept unsullied, and they must be an example. When they put the badge on their chest, that's a symbol of trust that's bestowed upon them. So they must, their veracity, their integrity must be above reproach. They have to appropriately enforce the law, which means that they never act officiously or permit personal feelings or prejudice, political beliefs, aspirations, animosities, friendships to influence their decision. In other words, they're to enforce the law impartially without bias. And then, again, it's a public trust. The office is a public trust. The badge is a symbol of that public trust. And if you think about it, a law enforcement position, a law enforcement officer is granted rights that the average citizen aren't. And those rights are the ability to take away your liberties and to use force to bring compliance about up to and including deadly force if necessary. That's a high standard. That's a high calling. And the people that give you that trust, the taxpayers and the community that you serve, have the right to demand absolute integrity and compassion, empathy, and good decision-making on your part.
So, bearing in mind the content in which and the context in which you've just given us, the oath that an officer swears in his allegiance to his state, and over here in the UK it would be to the crown, whatever, because everything comes under the Queen. Well, we're not talking about here, we're talking about over there in particular. Can you understand why there is such an outcry and an outpouring of anger towards officers, especially over the last 10, 20 years, where there's numerous occasions there has been evidence of corruption or negligence or wrongdoing with no accountability and almost a disregard to the very community who they've actually sworn their oath to serve and protect.
Absolutely, I can understand the frustration and the anger. Now, I want to kind of put this in a context. There are, and I honestly believe, the majority of the law enforcement officers out there are good, hardworking men and women that strive to do the right thing. There are, like with any profession, there are officers that do not hold that same standard. And the unfortunate thing that police have to understand, as well as the community must understand, is that they're subject to a higher scrutiny. They're subject to a more intense scrutiny from the community. And when an officer does something wrong, it affects all officers across the United States. And a prime example of that is several years ago, there was a former officer with the Boise Police Department in Idaho. He had
Are you there, Jerry? Hello, Jerry. Oh, come on. Jerry? Okay, let's, sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. We'll get that call right back for you. Sorry about that, Jerry. I lost you for a minute.
That's okay. I said in Mapp versus Ohio, the exclusionary rule was set up to punish law enforcement for their inappropriate actions. In that case, it was a case where officers entered a home without a search warrant and then wound up looking for a bombing suspect, I believe it was, and then wound up arresting the woman involved because there was some materials that not involving in a bombing. It was pornographic materials that were not acceptable. She appealed, and the evidence that was seized without a warrant was thrown out, and the exclusionary rule came about, and that's known as the fruit of the poisonous tree. And then under Brady versus Maryland in 1963, what we see in the exculpatory rule is that if there's anything that is going to benefit the defense, the prosecutors must disclose that to the defense attorney. And we're not seeing that happen. So what we're seeing is a systematic failure in the entire judicial system. If you look back in the last 50 years since Brady versus Maryland was established, you can see countless times where prosecutors, or let me back up, where law enforcement officials have not given evidence regarding their officers that were exculpatory to the prosecutor, or evidence that they found that would have been beneficial to the accused, they're not providing it to the prosecutor. In the times that they do present it to the prosecutors, we also see prosecutors not disclosing that to the defense counsel. And then when the defense counsel finds that out, after somebody may have been incarcerated for 20 years and it gets appealed and the person gets exonerated, it just destroys the trust. Then what we find is our judicial system, the judges are not holding the prosecutors accountable for their failure to act under Brady versus Maryland. In fact, less than 2% of our prosecutors ever get any kind of disciplinary action against them for failing to disclose Brady material. And when they do, it's so minor. It's usually just a public censure, a letter in their file, and that's it. So we need to see it go from the bottom of the line, which is law enforcement, the initial enforcement, all the way through the judicial system to the judges.
So at what point do you feel the real breakdown is taking place as far as the administration of law is concerned and justice?
That's a good question. I think it's breaking down several places. I think as the world becomes more, or as the communities become more hostile towards law enforcement, and don't get me wrong, I think law enforcement has created a self-inflicted wound for themselves, and I'll adjust with that answer first. In law enforcement, when I was a young officer, in fact, I was still in training, I watched an officer push a guy into a car that he was arresting, and it disturbed me. It bothered me, and afterwards I said, "What was that all about?" And he said, "You didn't see him rear his head back and try to headbutt me, did you?" I said, "No, I didn't see that at all." And he said, "Well, that's what he had, and you need to watch. That's why you're training. You need to watch a little closer." And I still felt he didn't do that. So I went to my lieutenant and I said, I was disturbed by this, and I don't think it was a fair treatment of the individual. And my lieutenant looked at me and said, "You are a young officer. He's a very experienced officer. And he gave you an explanation, and you're telling me you don't believe it." He said, "I would be very careful on how you handle that, because ultimately, when you're out on the street by yourself and you're getting your back end kicked, 3 minutes response time is a long time when you're getting beaten." And the message was very clear: don't criticize or don't point a failure out to another officer or another officer. So, and I'm ashamed of this. What I found myself doing within my first year is, when I thought something like that was going to happen, was turn away from it. However, when I became a sergeant, I let my people know, the subordinates and the people that worked for me, I would not tolerate that kind of behavior, and there would be disciplinary actions as a result of that. And so I started working as a supervisor, a first-line supervisor, in correcting that, and carried that through to a chief of police. And by the time I left the chief of police position, I believe we have, and the community would say, we had a very ethical police department.
Okay, let's flip this. How hard is it for an incoming officer to maintain his standard of integrity, morals, and principles that he entered the force in once he starts coming around fellow officers that are long-standing? How difficult is it to maintain that integrity? What are they coming against?
That depends on the culture of the organization or the department. If the culture of the department is one of unethical behavior, it's extremely difficult. In fact, what will happen is that officer will either be squeezed out by the unethical officers, or they will choose to leave on their own and go to work for a different agency. You can't survive as an ethical officer in an unethical culture. It just doesn't work. Or you adjust and you fall within that culture, and then you're just as guilty as anybody else. That's the first problem. And that is a top-down leadership strategy from the highest levels down. And we see examples of that. We see examples where officers have done the correct thing, but because of culture of the department within the community, we see the community rise up and have a fit over an action that officer had taken, even though that action may have been legally correct. The culture of the department has affected the community to the point where there's mass demonstrations and sometimes even destruction of property.
Wow! So you've got an officer who's dreamt his entire youth about being able to be an officer and serve and protect his community. Maybe even looking up to somebody that he felt had done a great job when he was growing up, etc. Or even just watching movies and stuff like that and thinking, well, that's what I'd like to contribute and that would be like my legacy. And then he gets there, he goes and swears that oath, which at the time, would you say every officer who swears the oath with the same passion? Or would you say that that there are officers that are going in there and actually have no regard for the oath? It's just another stepping stone to getting into the job.
I would like to say that they all swear it with the same passion, but I don't believe that's realistic. There are some, and the good officers really do. Those others of them see that as that's just a formality of what they have to do in order to graduate from the post academy, and they go about. That's the whole tarnishing of the badges that they're not looking at. In fact, Sir Robert Peel said the police are the community and the community are the police. Yeah. And that is the standard for community policing throughout the world. And yet we've lost that ability to recognize that. Police officers are the same as the community, and the community are the same as them. The only difference is the community, by choice, has given them the authority to take action that the average citizen cannot. And what they've done in regard for issue of trust that goes with that, and it's incumbent upon the law enforcement industry and the individual officer to hold that trust in high regard and to honor that through their actions and behaviors.
You see, because as a child growing up, and I'm giving away my age here because I'm quite old. As a child growing up, it was quite common where if you went home and told your parents that you were stopped and harassed by a police, or you were arrested, or you were beaten by the police, or anything else like that, you are likely to get a repercussion, a repeat of that beating from your parents, because their belief was, well, you must have been up to something, because the level of trust and respect that was given to an officer was so high that the parents, as much as they loved you, respected the law. And as far as they were concerned, if you've been stopped by an officer, if you've been pulled in by an officer, if there's something that you must have done to contribute towards that, and you're going to get another whooping to go with it, right?
Absolutely.
But now a child goes home and tells their parents that an officer has done this or said this or pulled them over that way, and there's uproar. Even before there's any common sense research into the situation or the circumstance that surrounded the issue, the immediate reaction is, how dare they? And is that how dare they part of that distrust that's broken and split the community from law enforcement?
Absolutely. And I can go one step further. If you look, when I first started my career in law enforcement, and it wasn't that long ago, it was in 1997, the position of the judges were, if there was testimony from myself and testimony from someone that was accused of a crime, and there was no video, no audio, it was just my word against theirs, the judge would look, literally sat from the stand and looked at the accused and said, this officer has nothing to gain by their testimony, and you have things to gain by not being honest. Therefore, given the standing of the two, I will side with the officer. That switched from, okay, that, not necessarily with me, because I still had that integrity, and the judge still felt that if I said something, it was true, and I didn't do anything to violate that trust. But I saw it go from, that was a standard for almost every officer, to, okay, if it's not on video or if it's not on audio, then we're going to have to question the veracity of the officer.
Now there you have it, right there in that sentence, right?
Right.
So once upon a time, an officer would stand there, and his word would be law, right? His word would be standing. His word would be based on a platform of integrity and trust and respect for the badge that he wore, the position that he had, and the service that he provided, right? And it wasn't a case of having to look into his history or look into his past records to discover whether or not he was a good man or not. The fact that he served the community wearing that badge was sufficient enough for a judge and a parent to trust his judgment. So how did we get from a police officer being revered in such high degree to now almost every decision he makes being questioned?
I believe that that's a self-inflicted wound from within the law enforcement community. I believe, and that's the basis for the tarnishing of the badge book, I believe that our failure to, and I say that I'm no longer in law enforcement, but law enforcement's failure to self-police has resulted in the corresponding distrust from the community. And let me give you some examples of that. In Idaho is a state in which disciplinary actions or personnel actions are exempted from disclosure to the general public. That's one of the things that I'm fighting, and I'm really beginning to fight against, is changing that. In 2 weeks, I will have a draft legislation drafted. I'm having an attorney do it right now, called the Public Employees Accountability Act, which changes the law to allow public disclosure of personnel records and disciplinary action. There's twofold on that. As a chief of police, when I took over a department that was in chaos, one of the resulting things is I had to get rid of some of the officers that didn't have the integrity that I was looking for within the department. And as they were starting to leave and being dismissed, the local newspaper began attacking. And one of the problems is when people are left with a void of information, they tend to fill that void with negative information. So there were always these questions of what's going on at the police department? What is this chief doing? Is it a management problem? Why are people leaving? And it continued on. So finally, I sat down with my city manager, and as a chief of police, I was the second highest ranking official in that community. And I sat down with the city manager and the local editor of the paper, and I said, let's meet off the record. Let me be able to explain to you why some of these people are leaving. And I sat down, and for 45 minutes, I went through a discussion of what led to, and the actions I had taken to dismiss these officers. When I got to the end of that, I stopped, and this gentleman sat back, took a big sigh, and said, man, I wouldn't want to have your job. And I said, now that you have the back information, this was all off the record, I said, now that you have the back information, do me a favor and get off my back. And he never printed anything negative about a dismissal after that. And that's the kind of actions that must be taken. Now, I'd like to take it one step further, and I believe that anybody, and this is going to be controversial, people are not going to like this, especially public employees. I believe, first of all, a public employee is paid by the taxpayer dollars of that community. So as a taxpayer, we have the right to know what disciplinary actions are being taken and what behaviors are being enforced within the community.
Absolutely.
And it's twofold, because as a chief of police, of the, I believe it was 23 terminations I had over a 9-year period, I would love to have those records opened up, because the individuals could then look at it and say, okay, he gave a written warning, an employee improvement plan, and then a termination notice, which was ultimately approved and accepted by the city manager. Those processes were always followed, and I would love to have people be able to open up and see, as an administrator, I was following the code of ethics, I was following the policies and procedures that were laid out for that community, and I was doing the right thing. To this day, they don't know that. They just know that there were a bunch of terminations that occurred, and it could have been because I was a jerk, or it could have been because they were valid. So I want to see that any public official or any public employee, I want to see the exemption removed from the law where those records can be found. And what you'll find is the states that have the strongest non-disclosure records for government employees and especially law enforcement, you'll find the highest level of police corruption. You see that in California, you see that in Florida, and you see that in New York. The biggest police corruption scandals that have come out of those three states. And those three states have the toughest disclosure laws under Freedom of Information Act. So I want to see that change nationally. If you're a public employee, the public has a right to look at your personnel file. Now, for most public employees, it's not going to affect them at all. For people in high political incidents or high public incidents, they very well may be looked at. And we need to be. That's the trust that was given to us. And if you'll see, the New York, the Harvard Business Review in 2011, I believe it was, 10 or 11, had an article. And in that article said an executive or a CEO, if they can bury a problem, they will within their organization, unless they believe it's going to become a public relations nightmare. And what we see within law enforcement is we see so often something goes wrong and the community wants to know what's going on. And the first response is, well, one, it's under investigation. We don't have to disclose anything that's under investigation. And the second response is that's a personnel matter. We can't talk about it. The public has a right to know. And they have a right to know because they are the ultimate payer. They pay the salary. The private industry is going to say, well, wait a minute, as a individual in a private industry, I don't have that kind of scrutiny. And my argument would be, oh, yes, you do, because the people that are responsible for paying your salary and making sure your salary is being paid knows what's going on with your disciplinary issue. And they know it to the point of whether they're going to terminate you or not. As a public employee, the taxpayers are those people, and they have the right to know. That's the first step. The second step is, at any given point, you chose to work in the public sector. And if you didn't want that kind of scrutiny, you can always go find a job someplace else. And those are harsh words and harsh terms. But again, what I said early on was lack of transparency. In an organization, self-policing never works without a corresponding demand for transparency or obligation for transparency. Because of the nature, it's too easy to hide wrongdoings under that cloak of secrecy, and that's also why the silence of law enforcement or the thin blue line philosophy works.
Okay, look, watch this. So, in a case of unlawful killing, police trying to cover up an incident where they did wrong and the person that they've killed or shot was innocent, who has the most to lose if it's disclosed, if it's proven that this was definitely... Who has the most to lose?
Let me break that down. First of all, the person that had the most to lose was the person that was wrongfully killed.
No, taking him out of the equation. Because for me, I want to get to the corruption, the cover-up side. So once we, no disrespect, we understand that the person who loses the most is the person that's lost his life, always. But his life is now gone, and now here we are in the middle of some sort of a investigation, so to speak. Who has the most to lose?
It's twofold. The officer runs the risk of... The officers have qualified immunity. So if there's a willful misconduct or gross negligence, and there's a constitutional violation under U.S. Title 42, Section 1983, they can be sued individually, and the organization in which they are employed or the municipality or state agency that they're employed can also be sued. Realistically, the one that has the most to lose is the deepest pocket, which is going to be the employer or the state, either the city or the state that is employing this individual.
So the state having the most to lose is
State or city.
Yep, state or city is normally the one that will start dictating and directing the way that this investigation pans out.
In a critical incident with a fatality, there's a twofold investigation that goes on. One side is the criminal investigation to determine whether or not the officer did something criminally wrong, whether they should be charged with manslaughter, murder, whatever those charges may be. Generally, it's going to be voluntary manslaughter. And then there's an administrative review going on concurrently from the police department's position. Now, it's important to understand that under the criminal investigation, the officer has all the right against self-incrimination. They have a right for an attorney. They have a right to not answer due to the possibility of incrimination. But when you step over into the administrative review as an administrator, I can compel an officer to speak and answer questions, and they don't have that right to a Fifth Amendment protection. Okay. The reason for that is so as an administrator for that city, I can determine what the liability is for that information, that city or that entity. What liability are we running based on the officer's actions? How do we deal with that? Now, the criminal side can share information with the administrative side. If they discover something, for instance, I'm going to use an extreme example. Let's say under the criminal side, the guy had gotten guy or gal had gotten their Miranda rights, and they shot the person because that person was a person of color and they didn't like them. That could be disclosed to the administrative side, which would ultimately or should automatically be the grounds of a termination and some sort of settlement to the family. Now, let's take it the other side and switch over to the administrative side and say that person under the administrative review said, yeah, I killed the person because they're a person of color and I didn't like them. That information could not be shared with the criminal side, but action could be taken from an administrative review for termination of that person. Right. And those two must remain separate and apart for those protection reasons. And sometimes those get blurred. And if that happens, if the administrative side discloses information to the criminal side, it cannot be used. It's fruit of the poisonous tree, and it just can't be used. And then the officer has a claim against the department itself.
So now you've got the state who's now trying to make sure that they can minimize what it's gonna cost them if this goes against them. And so, am I right in believing that if he's found to be within his rights to have unloaded his weapon, and they do not find a grounds for a criminal conviction, then that will minimize the payout that they will get in a civil lawsuit?
Theoretically, yes. That's certainly going to be used as a defense in the civil lawsuit, because the attorney for that organization is going to say, look, he was proven to be within his scope of authority, and that's why he or she took that action. There can still be a wrongful death claim, and that can still be successful, but it will most certainly probably make the case go to court to be tried, opposed to having it settled. If, for instance, if let me give you the reverse of that, Kervin. If I wrongly took action that led to somebody's death, one, I could be charged criminally for it, and two, if I were charged criminally for it, the attorney for the family is going to be saying, look, he was proven wrong. The city should have known, did know, or should have known that the person didn't have appropriate training, and that will certainly or most likely lead to a higher judgment or award for that family. So yes, I guess the answer, it's a long-winded answer to yes, it potentially could. Yeah. But if they're not found wrong, it doesn't necessarily take away the civil award that will occur. And the perfect example of that probably is the Philando Castillo case, where the officer was acquitted of any wrongdoing, yet the city paid their his compensation, comp time, and other time out for him to voluntarily resign from the department. Now, I don't know all the facts of that case, but I'm surprised by the jury verdict, and I
think we were all surprised by the jury verdict based on the evidence that was presented and what was witnessed, especially on the uploading of the streaming of the live incident as it took place. I think that the whole world watched and held its breath. But
in fairness to the jurors, in that we didn't see all the evidence, and there may have been things that occurred before that weren't uploaded. I'm not justifying the officer's action. Please don't think I am. No, I was surprised by it, but the court system is such that, and this is why disclosure is so important. If we had disclosure laws that would allow us, under the Freedom of Information Act, after the case was settled, we could pull all the evidence, all the reports, and review it for ourselves, and get a broader view than what we have right now.
You know, one of the things, one of the cases I remember doing over 2 years ago, which I found shocking, and I'm not sure if you've got much insight into, was the John Crawford shooting in the Walmart. Do you remember this one?
Vaguely, yes.
So there you have a man, and all the evidence was quite clear. The man was shopping in a shop. He'd found a BB gun on the shelf, and he was walking with it in the shop. Basically, you've got a gentleman who picks up his phone inside the shop and say there's a man walking around waving a gun, and oh look, there he is. He's pointing at the child. He's pointing at the kid and a woman, and etc. And the biggest thing that shocked me when you witnessed that, and I saw the video over and over and over again. Bearing in mind, as a police officer, you've arrived at a scene where someone has made a call to say that there's an armed man on the scene, waving a gun at people, but you arrive there and there's nobody running out screaming, right? There's nobody running around going, "Oh, there's a man with a gun!" Everything, people are still just walking around shopping. There doesn't seem to be any panic taking place. John Crawford was shot within 3 seconds of the police coming on site. Not one officer looked for a manager to confirm whether or not there was anybody in danger. There were people being served at the counter. There were people walking around the aisle still doing their shopping. And the last words that you hear from John Crawford before he stops breathing was that it ain't real. It wasn't real. And at the time, he was actually on the phone talking to his girlfriend, and his father had just walked into the house, while his girlfriend was talking to him as he died and gave his last breath. And for me, I couldn't understand how officers could arrive at a scene where, and I get it, you know, you're in a public place, you've got a report saying that there's a man with a gun and there's a live situation taking place, but you arrive and there is no assessment of the situation. Nobody tries to, you know, evacuate people to make sure that people are safe. They go in there, they go to the aisle, and they offload almost immediately. And yet, there's still no recrimination. The investigation, there's still no justice for John Crawford or his family. And I'm just wondering, as an officer, right, or as a chief of police, What would your instruction would have been to your officers had you sent them to a scenario like what we've just described with John Crawford?
Okay. First of all, they're going to get dispatched by a dispatching agency, and the information they get is what comes over the radio, and that's all they get. Let me back up. All shootings of this type are viewed under what is a statute found in a tort claim statute, but it's basically called the reasonable officer standard. And the reason for that is officers react differently to potential threat situations than the average citizen. They see things as a higher threat or a different threat than the average citizen does. And that's based on training and experience. Okay? The 3 seconds seems like a very short period of time to me without knowing all the facts. But I can tell you there's a misnomer that somebody has a fake gun and they point it at a police officer and the police officer is supposed to see that it's a fake gun. There's not enough time because action always beats reaction. The way, and the person knows what they're going to do, and as an officer, you're only reacting. And if you wait, it's too late. By that I mean if you wait for the person to fire at you, you're already in trouble. So that's the first step. The second step is, and it's important to understand that in a field in which 97% of what an officer does involves effective communication skills, there's very little communication training provided in police academy. In fact, in my police academy, I had 4 hours of what they called verbal judo. And it's a way of kind of de-escalating. That was 4 hours out of 10 weeks. So it's woefully inadequate when the majority of our skills should be verbal skills and de-escalation skills. They don't get enough training at that. It's tactical. That's the first failure. Now, given the scenario, it's not uncommon when you walk into a busy place, let's say a mall or a Walmart, people may not even be aware that he had a gun. And unless he's holding somebody hostage, they may or may not know that the threat is there. That's not justifying it. That's just, it seems like in the scenario you laid out, there should have been a little more interaction between Mr. Crawford and the officers. But if Mr. Crawford pointed the gun at the officers,
at no time did the gun get raised. At no time. The whole video footage shows. And what they did was, at one point they ran the caller's video, the call, along parallel with the video, the CCTV footage of the shop, showing John Crawford in the shop. And as the woman and the child walked across the aisle, John Crawford, they didn't even interact with each other. The woman and the child didn't see John Crawford. John Crawford didn't see them. But this guy is standing there saying, "Oh, look, he's just waved the gun at he's pointing the gun at the child." Right now, I get that the police didn't see that and don't know whether or not that's what took place. They couldn't have known because all they're doing is receiving a full phone call from a guy who's making a hoax call. It's it was proven it was a hoax call because once they ran the call parallel with the video footage, what the guy was saying on the phone wasn't actually what was happening in the shop. It was quite clear, right? But again, you can't fault the police for that because they didn't know that. My concern is the way that they approached the scene without no verification or clarification of what was taking place, and there was no assessment, because for me, if I've just had that call telling me that there's a guy waving a gun at people and this is a live situation, I'd expect to arrive there and there's people screaming or waving their hands or running out of the shop because there's some madman lunatic waving a gun in the shop. But what I'm saying is, when the police arrived, there was no panic, there was no screaming, there was no shouting, there was no, "Hey, there's a guy with a gun in there." There was none of that. He was still in the aisle talking to his girlfriend on the phone. He had the phone in his hand, and yes, the BB gun that had been picked up from the shelf because the Walmart sold those BB guns, and somebody's obviously picked it up off the shelf while they're walking around, opened it, and then left it on the shelf. And he's picked it up. Video showed him pick it up from the shelf and walk down the aisle with it. God knows why he picked it up. The biggest mistake he made cost him his life. I haven't got a clue why he picked it up, but at that time he was the only person in the aisle. So you could have assumed that when he got round to the end, he might have been handing it into the till saying, by the way, this is what I found when I was on my way down this aisle. Right? But we'll never know that, right? Because he's on his own in the aisle. There's no one else there. He's gone to he's picking something off the shelf, and there's the BB gun that's been opened out of its package and left there. And he's picked that up, but he's carried on, but he was in the middle of a phone call to his girlfriend, which he stopped at the end of the aisle to continue with.
Here's some of the expectations, given the scenario that you gave me, that I would have expected. One, if the gun is not pointed at you and it's pointed down, there should have been some sort of commands to drop the gun, or to put the gun down. And without that happening, shooting prior to that is premature and subject to criminal prosecution. I was in a situation where I was a backup officer. I was teaching a class, and I was a detective sergeant, and we get a call of a domestic in progress. An officer that was within a few minutes of the scene, and I was just a few minutes away. So I decided I was going to run out as a backup because the other officers were 20 minutes out. So I went to the backup, and as I was driving, I got a call, the officer out on radio, that he has a less than lethal shotgun already out. We get there, we approach the subject. He's standing on the front porch in a pair of shorts, his foot in a mobile cast, and his hands up with palms facing out towards us. We tell him to step down off the porch, and the other officer fires a less than lethal shotgun. So we took 2 steps. Within 10 seconds of walking into from the call from my arrival, walking into the driveway of the resident, there was within 10 seconds the first shot was fired. 2 steps were taken, and the second shot was fired. Then I put him in cuffs. I actually testified against that officer because I believed that was an inappropriate shooting. Yeah. The officer perjured himself on the stand and was acquitted. And I was ready to leave that police department. The chief of police wound up leaving just a couple of days after that. Verdict was found, and then that's why I remained with that police department. But I actually and took a lot of heat for testifying against a fellow officer. Yeah. And there were comments that officer had made because he had taught the less than lethal course. And in that course, he made a statement that said he wanted to be the first person on the block with a confirmed kill.
Wow.
And when I disclosed that to the prosecutor and told the prosecutor of the other officers that were in the room, not one of them remembered that. I talked to them privately, and they said, yeah, I know he said that, but I'm not going to say that. And that's where that thin blue line comes about. I don't know that would have been, transparency would have changed that any in that particular case, because you can't do anything when somebody's not being truthful. It's very difficult. It was my word against several other officers who claimed that they never heard him say that. But that's the kind of that code of silence that ruins the credibility of law enforcement officers.
It is. And for me, you've got this hierarchy, right? Because you start with the officers. They're the ones that are acting on the ground. Then you've got their superiors, which would be either the chiefs of the police, sergeants, etc., because somewhere along the line there's a support of a cover-up long before it gets to the district attorney, right?
Yes, what you have is you have a patrol officer, then you generally have a corporal, then you have a sergeant, then you have a lieutenant, then you have a captain, which is usually the bureau commander, and then you have a deputy chief or a chief, and then chief. So you have those layers that occur. If the culture is you don't talk about it, it's the same philosophy that I had an officer when I was first hired that said, I will never cite or arrest another officer. That's just a professional courtesy. And my question was, well, what if he did something wrong? I don't care. And then I pushed it a little further. I said, so if he committed a felony, you wouldn't arrest him. Well, in that case, I would arrest him. Well, what if it's a misdemeanor? Well, give me an example of a type of misdemeanor. And a common one was, driving under the influence. And he said, no, I wouldn't arrest him. I would take him home. And I said, okay, so would you do the same thing for an average citizen? Oh, no, I'd arrest him. I said, so why does an officer who's sworn to a standard to uphold themselves above an average citizen, why would he get more, or he or she get more courtesy, if you will, or exemption from the law than the average citizen? And he said, well, that's just a professional courtesy. That's the way we do things. And I said, well, I'm not going to do it that way. And it was just so. And if you look back at the very beginning of the Code of Ethics, where I said we're not going to let friendships or political affiliations or associations sway our need to enforce the law, that's a clear violation. That's a clear ethical violation. Yet it happens day in and day out. Now, I used to say, I was asked this question by another officer that was applying for a position with us, and I said, look, I will never extend to an officer any more leeway or leniency than I would to an average citizen of this community. So if I'm going to write a ticket for a speeding ticket for a citizen that's going 12 miles an hour over the speed limit, and then I stop a police officer that's going 15 miles an hour over the speed limit, I would cite that police officer. And I had a police officer one day, he was driving 25 miles an hour over the speed limit when I stopped him. And the first thing he did was he handed me his badge, and he said, how about some professional courtesy? And he showed me the badge, so I asked him to give me the badge so I could actually hold it. And he said, why? I said, I want to verify it. So he handed me the badge. And I looked at him and I said, sir, tell you what, I'll extend you the same courtesy that you extended me by driving 25 miles an hour over the speed limit in my community. If you want me not to give you a ticket, I am going to maintain your badge. I want your supervisor's name and number, and I will mail it back to him with a copy of this video and the discussion we had. And he said, well, I don't want you to do that. I said, here's your badge. I'll be back with your ticket.
Listen, a thought just crossed my mind, Jerry. Do different officers, not officers, but departments, do you get audited at all?
Audited by external forces outside of the police department?
Or external organizations outside the force?
The only time you truly get an audit like that is one, if you invite it in, or two, the Department of Justice is there's enough community outrage that they're looking for violations.
So why a standard yearly, annual, monthly, quarterly audit? For example, let me just, when you imagine the significance of the importance of the role that law officers play in the community and in our society in general, I I'm an engineer, and we build, where I work, we build the fuel tanks for Jaguar Land Rover. And we have 3 audits. We have an internal audit that we do for ourselves. We have a company audit, which could be any other department or from any other country in the world that is part of our organization, because I represent the Caltex Uniparts company. Anyone from Uniparts, any department from Unipart will come from any different country around the world and audit each other. And then we have the basic health and safety engineering audit. And these are audits that we have annually. And they come in and check our health and safety. They come and check all our paperwork. They make sure that we are standardizing everything in an appropriate way. And if we fail, we could lose our license to produce the goods that we produce for the companies that we're contracted to. Bam, just like that. Now, surely if different stations and different cities around the country were regularly audited, and their citations, their arrests, the records, documentation and statements and etc. were all part of that audit for authenticity, surely there'd be a greater attempt to uphold the law in a more integral way.
Correct. Now, I would say that we're getting at it. We're getting at the end result different ways. By that, in that, within a police department, you have officers that are making stops that will be looked at by their supervisor. I used to pull, as a sergeant or as a chief, I would pull everything we did in our patrol division. We had video dash cams, and then we went to body cams. So everything that every stop the officer ever made, unless they turned the video off intentionally, it was always recorded. So I could pull the tape and say, okay, let me look at this tape. And often when I got a complaint from the citizens, I'd get a type of complaint. Let's just take a minor one. I'd get a complaint where somebody was sitting in a bar and said, well, I got stopped by a cop and I was driving 28 miles an hour in the 25, and that's just BS. It shouldn't happen. And I'd get a complaint, and I'd go pull the tape, and what I'd find out is the officer walk up and say, yeah, after they introduced themselves and got the necessary documentation, they said, you have any idea why I stopped you? And the officer, and the guy said, yeah, I was speeding. Well, how fast were you going? I was going 38 to 25. Okay. So I called the gentleman in and I said, I want you to listen to this tape. We don't stop for 3 miles an hour over the speed limit. In fact, our standard at that time was, and it wasn't a mandated standard, but generally my personal standard was 9-year fine, 10-year mine. So at 9 miles an hour over the speed limit, I wasn't going to stop you. But at 10 miles an hour over the speed limit, I was going to stop you. And that was just my personal belief. So I said, most of our officers don't stop until you're 8 or above on a speed limit. Yeah. So to say it's 3 is ridiculous. But we could verify it. So what I'm saying is, as an internal audit, what you have is you have departments that internally audit themselves. If they are a ethical department, then they will correct deficiencies as they go along, much like your internal audit does from an engineering standpoint. Now, the process of transparency works because in a large department, Las Vegas Metro, in 2013, it's a sheriff's department that provides municipal protection for cities. But the Las Vegas Metro Police Department decided to go with a public open transparency situation, to the point where what used to happen is you'd have a critical incident. They wouldn't call the press, and they'd do everything to keep them as far away from it as possible. And the sheriff changed his philosophy and said, okay, when we have a critical incident, we are going to report it to the press, first of all. Then at the scene, after scene protection and press areas are set up, the commanding officer at the time, which is either a sergeant or the lead investigator or the public information officer, will make a statement to the press. They will give them the rough, we were dispatched to a welfare check. We found 3 bodies, and in the process of that, we wound up in a shooting, and the suspect is deceased. We'll have more information as it becomes available. Then they have a mandate that within 7 days, the public information officer or the bureau commander of that division will do a videotaped press conference and giving a summary of what's going on. And they give it out to the press and they put it out on their website. And then if it's a fatal situation, usually it takes them about 86 days to on average, complete the investigation. If it's a non-fatal, it takes about 106. And at the end of that investigation, they have a press conference in which they answer questions. They take the summary of their investigative findings and they put it on their website, and it becomes transparent. And since they've done that, the respect within the community and the trust in the community has risen dramatically from 2013 to today in 2017. That is just a model of how a large police department can use transparency and use it effectively. And their relationship with media has gotten tremendous. Again, if the media is the media can be a strategic alliance for any chief of police or department, because if we're being transparent and we're being honest with them, there's no need for them to fill the gaps that we can't tell them at the time with negative information. At that point, they're willing to give us the benefit of our good intentions. And what's happening is that the complete opposite's happening. The media is only here to bash the cops, and the cops kind of take a victim mentality. And I'm going to be very clear, and I've taught this over and over again, you are not a victim. You cannot be a victim unless you see yourself as a victim.
Yeah. Okay.
And if you see yourself as a victim, then you see yourself as hopeless and there's nothing you can do. And I disagree with that, and I would challenge law enforcement with every fiber of my being to change that, because they're not helpless to this. They need to be they need to work a little bit more with the press. The press is not your enemy unless you're hiding and being unethical, and then it has the right to be your enemy. But the problem has occurred over the last 20 years or 30 years of making it harder and harder for the press to get any information. And then, when you can't get information, the first natural human response is there's something rotten in Denmark, and we want to figure out what it is.
Here's the thing. Talking about these audits at my workplace, one of the problems that we found was that when these audits were coming, there'd be an announcement that in 2 weeks' time or a week's time, next week, the auditors are coming. And then all the various managers from different departments would come and run around the plant and say, right, and literally the day before the auditors were coming in, they'd be running around going, come on, we need to get this all in order, we need to make this tidy, we need to get that ready, and blah, 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 blah. And they would keep doing this. And we fed back to them, right? The place looks absolutely beautiful today because we've got it ready for these auditors to impress them. But what's wrong with us maintaining this as a standard? And what was wrong with us maintaining this as a standard was just a lazy culture that we had. So what the management then did was they now have what we refer to as the Gamba Walk. And they come round every week, once a week. And a different manager takes on a different area every week. And they come and do their own audit and inspection, right? Which means that every week we have a reason to keep our area in order, or all the various different lines that run. Now, if you had an audit taking place on a regular basis, and and it wasn't a thing where it was a self-governing, self-purpose-filling, where it was the locals or somebody within the organization that was there that was, heading it up. There would be more accountability, there would be more transparency, and there'd be a greater urgency to get things right. What I mean by that is the law enforcement agency as a whole has been deteriorating and becoming unpopular for a long time. This has not been an overnight thing. Yet no one has put anything in place to take it out of this really dire look that people actually have on it and bring it back into the place where it's supposed to be, which is sit down on the highest level of integrity that you still feel passionate about. And it's great that we have somebody with great passion and great integrity like you. But we need a Jerry Summers in every establishment. And without that, we're still providing a substandard service.
Let me back up a little bit with your example and point a couple things out. First of all, by feeding back to your management that we could keep this as a standard rather than, cleaning it up before the audit comes. You had a management that said, yeah, that makes sense. We can do that. We'll make that change. So there was a cultural structure in which they wanted self-improvement. What we're not and I don't want to say it's all police agencies, because that's not the case, because there are some progressive, very good police chiefs out there that are doing the types of things that I'm talking about doing. But the culture was, let's change, let's make it better. And we're not seeing that within law enforcement. In other words, well, that's not the way we do it. This is the way we do things. And like I said in my dissertation, I said, if you don't change from within, you're going to have change brought upon you from without. And the danger of that is that the change that's brought upon you from the outside is brought upon you from the outside on individuals that don't understand the intricacies of policing and police work and tactical responses and why we do what we do. So it's incumbent upon the actual police chiefs and structures to start working internally to make those changes. What you described to me was a complete internal audit, and police departments can do that internally without opening it up to the public. Now, I want to make the next step and make the transparency, in essence, the opening of the auditor coming in. The difference is that at any given point, you can be audited. So it kind of forces you to make it a standard and make it an appropriate standard. And it's cheaper than hiring an auditor to come in and do that. Because the first fight you're going to get from law enforcement on that is, who's going to pay for that? We're in declining budgets anyway. Okay. Do it yourself. Fix it yourself, and then let people come in and see what you're doing. And you will earn the trust of the public, or the administrator will find out that the public will find out that the administrator is not doing the job they're supposed to do, and they'll replace them with somebody who will. Yeah. And it's a simple solution, but the implementation of it is enormous. And quite frankly, I've tried to work within the law enforcement community for years in bringing about this change. I couldn't do it from within, but by God, I will do it from without. I am, that's what the community organization of Let's Make It Matter is all about. We are going to write legislation, and we're going to sponsor legislation that's going to enhance integrity and ethics within government and within law enforcement through transparency. And 2 weeks we have something that'll be coming out, and it's a simple solution. Law enforcement, that's where law enforcement is its mark. And unfortunately, as people progress within an organization, they take on that culture within that organization. And the kind of change that I'm looking for requires somebody at the top to say, no, we need to be more transparent. We need to do this, and this is how we're going to do it. There are models and they work effectively without, losing any of the secrecy you need within an investigation while it's being done, without disclosing anything. The second part of that is we're going to work very strongly to change the absolute immunity for prosecutors and change it into a qualified immunity. I'll give you an example that officers have qualified immunity. The very first arrest I made out of the police academy when I was in field training, I was sued on. And it made me ponder whether I wanted to stay within law enforcement. What happened was I made a traffic stop, and the husband and wife that were in the car both had no contact orders in place against each other. So they were both in violation of their no contact order. I go to talk to them about it. They both say they're not effective anymore. They're not true. And I checked through dispatch, who checked with the county that they were issued at, and they said, no, they're still in effect. So I arrested them both. Okay. The next day I found out that when we went back, because it was an evening, the records department of that county were not open at that time. But their dispatch said, yes, it was still in effect. The next day we find out that both of those no contact orders had been quashed, had been released by the court, but that county did not put it into the NCIC, which is National Crime Information System. So I made a false arrest on both of those people. But because of qualified immunity, I was working in good faith on the information that was provided for me. Therefore, I didn't do anything wrong. And the city that I worked for wound up paying $8,000, $3,000 for the male and $5,000 to his wife for the inconvenience of that. Okay. But I couldn't be sued. There was no way I could be sued. Now, let's assume that the dispatch had told me, oh, those had been quashed, and I arrested them anyway. At that point, now that qualified immunity doesn't hold because I was grossly negligent or incompetent or it was misconduct. When you look at the prosecutorial problems, when we talked about, Brady versus Maryland, when a prosecutor fails to, let's say he has evidence, and there's multiple cases through the Innocence Project and everybody else that says this prosecutor held this bit of information. The one that comes into mind was a gentleman that was accused of murder who was just recently exonerated. But in the files, he had a hotel receipt of being 5 hours away and hotel video showing he wasn't even in the city where the murder occurred. That was in the file. The prosecutor hid it, and he was convicted of murder and spent 20 years in prison. Now, there is no, with absolute immunity, which prosecutors have, there is no charges that can be filed against that.
And that's one of the biggest injustices.
It is.
I struggle with that. I deeply struggle with the fact that the prosecutor and the district attorneys, that there is actually no right that you have to prosecute them, even when they have gross misconduct issues based on the way that they've carried out a prosecution against an innocent individual. That has probably cost them a long period of their lives, breakdowns of their families, and all the other side effects and impacts that actually has on it.
We're looking to change that through legislation.
Great stuff. Now, I'm thinking, we were talking about transparency, and in that transparency, these dash cams, body cams, has all become part and parcel of a policeman's uniform now, right? And no, not every officer has one yet, but that's what we're heading towards. Most officers have a body cam, and most vehicles have a dash cam now. And most of them pick up what's going on, or should be picking up what's going on at a particular incident, arrest, or confrontation. My concern is, the amount of body cams that are switched off, which appear to be deliberate And even if it's not deliberate, there needs to be some sort of a reprimand so that the individuals get the hang of that this needs to be on. There's various sort of like examples that we can give in other work areas as to how you'd be impacted if you didn't follow a particular standard operational procedure. That should be a standard operational procedure. You're going into a live situation, that needs to be on. That's the first thing that you do, so you capture the whole event. And secondly, the other issue that I have is that the amount of body cams and dash cams that are not being released for evidence approval when there is a query or a question about the rightfulness or the wrongfulness of the particular approach or arrest. Now, how can the community as a whole be confident that they're being policed appropriately if the very equipment that the taxpayer is paying in order for the policeman to be equipped to do his job efficiently and effectively will not be released, reviewed, or used in support of or against the crimes that are being questioned or committed?
That's a two-point answer. First of all, they can't. And so I would agree with you. Now let me give a disclaimer there. It's a matter of when it gets released. For instance, there are times in an incident where a body cam will pick something up that is critical in an investigation of a crime. And the law enforcement agency should not be demanded or should not be forced to release that information because it could affect prosecution or charging. However, once that case has played itself out, I believe that should be released. It should be open to public records release. Where you're going to run into some issues is there are times in law enforcement where you cannot release it because there's critical information to either finding the suspect or prosecuting the suspect that if you release it too early will affect the prosecution of the case. That's just a reality of what happens. So there are times during an investigation, that's why when something is currently under investigation, law enforcement does not have to release the body information.
Now, here's the thing. I think we can all abide with that one. That's a no-brainer, right? But let's talk about the one where an officer kills, either deliberately or accidentally, kills an innocent person or someone he believes to be guilty, that later there's all sorts of discrepancies and questions as to the legality of that kill, right? Now, the individual's dead. He's now passed, he's deceased, and the officer is exonerated from any prosecution because someone had come forward and said, well, he was in his right, this guy pulled the gun and this guy did this or whatever, but there's no other evidence. The only place you can find the evidence to substantiate the officer's version of events is on that cam, but yet they still won't release it. And this person is being allowed, the deceased person's family has been tainted with the impression that this individual was in a criminal activity when that's being questioned. Now, we're talking about several incidents to date where dash cam bodies, body dash cams and dash cam videos and body cams have been refused to be released, where there has been an unlawful killing or questionable shooting. Someone's been killed and an officer has not been charged, and the only place that the evidence can be found is on that video. Now, that's the sort of stuff that I'm talking about. And I'm just wondering, if in the event of an incident like that taking place, the footage and the statements were to be given to an independent body, just as you'd get an independent jury of peers who would sit down and preside over a prosecutorial case, right? And they would review the evidence that was submitted along with the dash cam or the body cam video evidence that's provided, and say, well, hang on a minute, this doesn't match. Because at the minute, it's been done internally and then buried. And the families who are trying to get the answers they need for their loved ones are hitting a stumbling block. sometimes for years, many years in some occasions, that is building up, again, more animosity, more frustration, and adding fuel to the fire of these organizations that are challenging law enforcement as a whole. Surely there's something that could be set up to test the authenticity of these video footages that can then come back and say, well, that's correct.
That is why you're seeing police oversight commissions coming up. That's why you're seeing ombudsmans coming up, being put into place. Here's the problem. The best people equipped to look at whether police tactics were done correctly are police officers and investigators and administrators themselves. Unfortunately, the feeling from the community is that they look at that in a fair and ethical manner. Let me give you an example. In the state of Idaho, there have been 55 fatal shootings involving police officers. Not one of those have ever resulted in charges being filed against an officer. Now, there's two explanations for that. One, you have the thin blue line that's protecting officers, or two, the officers are so well trained that they do everything right. I am not naive enough to believe that Idaho officers are any better trained than any other state, and that we have it all right, because we don't. So then you have your oversight committee that now the other problem you have is you have an oversight committee that's made up of other officers, and you have this stigma of the thin blue line, which is, we're going to protect an officer, we're going to have the officers back no matter what. Now, I'm going to be very clear. If you have an officer, two officers, and that officer does something unethical or illegal, it is incumbent upon the other officer not to have their back and to bring it forward. It's incumbent upon their code of ethics, not the blue wall of silence, not the thin blue line. It's incumbent upon them to do that. And I can tell you day in and day out, that's not necessarily happening. There are pockets in which it's happening, but by and large, that's not happening. And that's what's led to the distrust and the tarnishment of the badge. So your oversight committee, then, if you then take it outside of law enforcement and say, okay, we're going to have attorneys and business people look at it, they don't understand the intricacies of the tactical reason. So law enforcement in and of itself has to be a key element in correcting and overseeing their internal investigations of other police officers. And you're very right. The point where we won't release something, then the first where everybody goes, and I'm not saying it's unfair, where everybody goes is, what are they hiding? Yeah. Let me give you an example. The Shelby case, I think it was in, I don't remember where, she shot the guy reaching into the car, and she's now charged with voluntary manslaughter. That's a perfect example of, by releasing the tape of the department, releasing that tape, and everybody being able to see it, force the department itself to do a correct investigation. And the fact that they released it tells me that internally that department would have done the right thing. Yeah. Because if they weren't, they would have never released the tape. There's another example of a city in Idaho where, and this was years ago, officers go to a disturbance call, they knock on the door, they call in, and you can hear the guy, you can hear a dog barking. It happened to be a pit bull, but you can hear the dog barking, and you hear the guy say, "Go," to the dog. And they step out, and you see the dog off of the dash cam jump up and try to bite the side of the officer. In fact, bit the OC, the pepper spray container. The officer turned and shot and killed the dog. Well, the media had a fit. Why would anybody shoot a dog? This is oversight. And the department turned around and released that video. And it quashed the complaint. Average citizens looked at that and said, well, we don't blame the officer. He was almost bitten. Of course he would shoot the dog. The dog was attacking him. That's the kind of thing that transparency and the releasing of that will solve. And rarely do. More and more, we're not seeing that happen. We're seeing the opposite happen, which leads to the distrust.
Yeah. And, distrust right across the board is what now lies between the law enforcement and communities having a reasonable and responsible relationship, and why we can't get the two to sit down at the table and talk as we used to.
It also leads to the unprovoked attacks on the officers.
Absolutely.
So law enforcement is not completely clean on this by not being transparent.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's totally their fault that somebody's attacking them. I don't believe anybody should attack anybody and kill them for any unprovoked reason. But in reality, that's what's happening. People are so inflamed and so angry because law enforcement is not being, or they believe law enforcement is not being open and honest to them, that it's becoming a vigilante mentality.
And that's a sad indictment of what we see happening across the United States of America right now. Tarnishing the badge has taken a real look at a lot of the problems that policing is having right across the board. But as we go into our last 10-15 minutes of this show, let's look at some of the things that are being done in order to bring about reform and a change where there can be a building of bridges between the police and the community. Where do you think that should start, Jerry?
It starts within the law enforcement community itself, first and foremost, in my opinion. It then extends out by changing the laws that allow the secrecy to occur, so that open transparency starts to occur, and then it also has to work within the judicial system for when prosecutors are involved in misconduct. They need to be held accountable as well, and that needs to be. I also believe that prosecutors should have open records or open file laws in which the defense attorney can come in and audit their files at any given time, or at least the evidence files at any given time. Maybe not the strategy files, but the evidence file. The defense has to have. Let me give you a prime example. If under Brady, if you're an officer and you lie in your official capacity, that's exculpatory information, and it must be released by your department and by the prosecutor to every defense attorney in every case that you are ever involved in. And it becomes a ground for reasonable doubt. Right. If I've been proven to perjure myself or lie in an official report, then the defense attorney has the right to know that, because if you're the accused and I'm the one charging you, did I lie about that? Yeah. That has to be in, and it's not coming in. That's known as being Brady dead. In other words, they're of use to the law enforcement industry because their credibility is completely destroyed. And there's a lot of officers, a lot of administrators that are hiding that. There was a huge case in Orange County where a judge prevented anybody in the Orange County prosecutor's office to handle the case because of Brady information that the sheriff's department had a database that they were not sharing information, or they actually were sharing it with the prosecutor's office, and the prosecutor's office was not sharing it with the defense attorney. And it was a huge case, and it's still working its way through the system. But that was a judge that had the guts and the fortitude to say, no, this isn't going to happen. We're not going to allow that. It was overruled by the state attorney general at the time, who's now a senator from California in our Senate. And now it's still going back through the process. And I think it should change some of the instances. So it has to happen within law enforcement first, foremost. The press needs to get involved. They need to get behind changing the open records law, because without the press getting involved, you don't get the kind of pressure that you need. And if the next step is then to have the legislation drawn, which we're doing, it'll be out in 2 weeks, and it'll be going out to the public for signatures to change the law. And we're going to start in Idaho, but the plan is being drawn is to go nationwide with that adjusting for the states that have closed record law. And we want to get enough feedback and enough signatures that from the voters that we can go ahead and put political pressure on our legislators to get behind it and change it.
Okay.
What I said at the beginning is the power to implement change in any government entity has always rested with its citizens. I'll do them. They just need to stand behind me and help me.
That's a great start. Here's another one to go forward with. The dash cams and body cams were brought in order to assist maintain transparency. So I understand what you said earlier on about sometimes you're in the middle of a case and there might be stuff on there that might be reasons not to release for whatever reason because it's an ongoing investigation. But where there is a question as to the legality of this particular officer's conduct, then would not a Supreme Court judge or somebody else in a good position say, well, okay, let's review this and say, let's review the legality of this before we go any further, just to make sure that there is integrity as well as transparency.
The way the system is set up, that's the prosecutor's role.
But the prosecutor can't be trusted. It's already evident that the prosecutor and the district attorney cannot be trusted.
There are some that can and some that cannot, but you're right. So, and I can take it one step further. So if the prosecutor doesn't do their job and they can't be trusted, who are you going to take it to? Because if you take it to the judge, the judges are not enforcing the regulations against and the ethics against the prosecutors that aren't doing their job.
Then maybe you need to set up an independent review panel that overlooks it all. I mean, we have the police complaints committee here in the UK, and then they're not made up of policemen. They're not made of white collar workers. It's an independent body that governs, that looks at, reviews, and can bring charges against those that are supposed to be carrying out the law. And so therefore, when there's a shooting, when there's an incident that's taking place that's questionable, people actually have the police complaints committee that they can go refer their cases to. And you're talking about the ombudsman, which is, I suppose the police complaints committee is a form of ombudsman, independent of the police force, because police doesn't work. We already know that. So why do we continue with the practice?
It doesn't work without transparency. And in essence, what you're saying is we're saying the same thing. You're using a commission or a committee to review it. And I'm using basically the power of the press and the community itself in reviewing it rather than having a select group to review it. My fear is with a select group like an ombudsman, City of Boise had an ombudsman, and when the chief went in there, he said, my goal is to get rid of the ombudsman position. Now, it's a lofty goal because the way he said he was going to do that was to clean up the department internally to where there was no need for that ombudsman. And eventually he succeeded before he retired. And that came about because the city of Boise had 5 or 7 shootings in the community, in fatality, and the community was having a fit about it. They thought it was too much. As a result of the work that the ombudsman did, and then later the chief came in and changed it, they haven't had those incidents since. So the question is, were those just sporadic coincidence, or were there really something that was not right? And I would suggest that there was probably something that was askew. They changed their training, they changed their communication, they changed something, and they changed the outcome.
Absolutely, because until you change the process, you're never going to change the result.
And what we're looking at, and what a lot of organizations are looking at, is they're looking at the symptoms and not the cause. And we need to look at the cause, and the cause is an internal problem within law enforcement and our judicial system that must be addressed internally and correct. And the only way we're going to get them to do it internally and correct it is through some sort of outside pressure.
You know, in chapter 3 of your book, Tarnishing the Badge, you headline it with one of my favorite quotes of all time, which is from Edmund Burke. The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is that good men do nothing. Are there not enough good men, Jerry?
I think there are good men. I think the system is good men and women. But I think there are enough good men and women within the system, but the cultures in which they're operating do not allow them to be so. That quote, I use that quote because, believe it or not, when I was asked to be the interim chief of police, I was really struggling with whether or not I wanted to be the chief of police in that community. And I met with a pastor of mine who happened to be a retired attorney out of Illinois. And I said, I just don't know that I want to do this. And he looked at me and said, Jerry, the only thing that good men, that evil needs to prosper is for good men to do nothing. If you don't step up and do this, you have no right to complain. And that's what made me put my application in. And so there are people in there. It just has to be culturally. They have to be either placed into a position to make change, or we have to force change from the outside through the community and community activism, I believe.
Yeah. Okay. Let's flip that for a minute, because we've had a real subject attack on law enforcement. How significant is the role, and not just in the community, but in community organizations, in trying to find a way forward for a peaceful resolution to policing in the community?
It's significant. It's huge. And again, transparency is what's going to bring that about. When people don't know what's going on internally and they don't know why it's going on, you can't help fix the processes. Law enforcement in the United States follows a fairly paramilitary procedure where they're reactive and not proactive. And what I did after I received my MBA, and prior to that, as I took business principles of customer service, employee retention, and service recovery failures systems, and put them into place within a law enforcement organization. And at first, I got a lot of objection to it. But I can tell you that we went from an organization where the average stay in our organization was 13 months to, when I left, the newest member had been there 4.5 years. And it can be done. It just there has to be the political will to do it. And the community, the elected officials, and the top-end organizations within the law enforcement have to be willing to look at themselves honestly and say, we've got a problem here, and it's up to us to fix the problem.
Do you know? Yeah, I agree. You know, when you have either the chiefs of police or commanders, sergeants, etc., whatever, who meet with community leaders in the midst of tragedy, is there ongoing relationships going on with sergeants, chiefs of police, and community leaders, or do they only meet when there is some sort of catastrophe or tragedy?
The good departments will have ongoing meetings. My point is, if you meet with somebody and they don't know who you are, and you meet with them during a tragic situation, it's too late. You should have been building strategic alliances within the business community and the political community way before that incident ever happened. And there was a chief of police that put it out there, and he put it out this way. The community, as a chief of police, I look at the community as a bank in which I must make daily deposits into that bank, because when a service failure occurs, there will be one that occurs eventually. I don't want to have to go back to the community and say, look, I need you to bear with me on this, and then turn around and hand me a sheet of paper that says insufficient funds.
Yeah.
That's what needs to be done. You need to build the relationships and the strategic alliances within the community before a problem occurs, so that when a problem occurs and it's questionable, you have the trust as the leader to say, bear with me, let me work through it, I'll take care of it, and then I'll get back to you and tell you what's being done. And business leaders, we believe you because we know you're a person of integrity.
You know, being a realist, when you look at places like Ohio, Florida, New York, and you know, places like that where you've had high levels of unlawful killings, Ferguson disruptions, etc. What is the likelihood of a local chief of police, commander, sergeant being able to rebuild a level of trust within the community and community leaders that they can start working together in some sort of peace?
It's a high likelihood. I did it. I mean, I walked into a department that was in chaos and considered unethical, and by the time I left for holding the city, a new city manager accountable for the laws that the average citizen has to look, and I was fired for that. We had an ethical department. We had built those trusts and those strategic alliances. Then I was let go. And I just had somebody tell me yesterday, I was at a meeting, came by and told me, my understanding is that the city has now become a corrupt city once again, and crime is on the rise. That's too bad. That took the political will. You have the political will. So a chief of police can go in there and make those changes. It takes time. I thought I could do it in a year and a half, and it took me about 3.5 years to change the culture in the organization.
How does that leave you feeling, knowing that the work that took you 3.5 to put into place has quickly been dismantled by somebody who's coming with less integrity than you?
Or I don't want to say that the current chief has less integrity. I don't know that. I don't know the man. I've never spoken to him. It really frustrates me because everything was, and the losers in that are the community itself. They're the ones that, and once again, they don't know what I did because those records aren't open. They didn't get a chance to see the kinds of changes that were implemented, and therefore they can't see the changes that have occurred and what's going on now. With that open records, then they can look at where it's going right now and say, we don't like that, we want this change. And they can either have the current chief of police make the changes, or they can bring somebody in who will.
Do you know, Jerry, it's been absolutely a pleasure talking to you today. Believe it or not, we've almost come to the end of our 2 hours, and it's flown by. And I'm not even sure if we got out everything that we wanted to get out. But just before we do come off here, is there anything that you want to add to this conversation, this discussion, that we just might have slipped over, gone over, or just missed?
I do. Ultimately, I am launching today. In fact, I'm doing this as an exclusive on your radio station. We are launching a community organization called Let's Make It Matter. You can go to letsmakeitmatter.com and you'll see what we're doing. I'm looking to get 1 million founding members at a one-time cost of $35 to support us, and we're going to change the transparency laws within the United States, and we're going to make a difference. So together, if you stand with me, we can make a difference. So go to letsmakeitmatter.com and then go and like the page, and then go like my Facebook page of letsmakeitmatter.com as well. Both of them have been launched while we're talking today.
Wow. Well, that's amazing. And Jerry, you truly have done amazing work and a remarkable individual. It's been an absolute honor and privilege, as well as a pleasure, having you on Issues Today on World Jam Global Radio. And I wish you luck. And we pray for you and the work that you've got ahead of you in what you're endeavoring to try and accomplish. Because believe it, when I say this, America needs it today. There are communities crying and hurting right across the states that need to see the transparency laws transformed in such a way that the trust between law enforcement and community can be rebuilt once again.
The honor has been mine. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I'd love to have you to have me back.
Well, Jerry, I'm going to take you up on that offer. I'm away on holiday in August, but I think when I get back in September, we're going to update on how Let's Make It Matter is doing. That I can promise you.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Jerry, God bless, and we'll speak again real soon.
God bless you. Thank you, Kervin.
Thank you, Jerry. Well, that's all for now on the issues today on World Jam Global Radio. I hope that you've been truly educated by what's going on in law enforcement and the great work being done by Jerry Summers and Let's Make It Matter organization. Don't forget, you can find him on letsmakeitmatter.com, www.letsmakeitmatter.com. My name's Kervin Julien. This is Issues Today on World Jam Global Radio. I'm out of here.
I already did my time. I paid for my crime. I already did my time. I paid for my crime. I already did my time. I paid for my crime. I already did my time. I paid for my crime. I already did my time. I paid for my crime. Back in the day, I didn't really care about the system. It was all about...
Please don't forget, next week there will be no Issues Today next week. I'm away for 1 week.
Young and foolish to stay in school. I learned my lessons in the streets. There was not a man I couldn't beat. I was good with my hands and very quick on my feet.
But we'll be back with another show on the 29th of July.
Money, life is so sweet.
Same time, same place, same frequency.
Rearrange.
You can join me again tomorrow morning for my Wake Up Everybody's gospel show,
Be no gangster.
where we do church before church.
All in jail. Trying to cope with this living hell. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my
But as for now, my dear friends,
crime.
that's been a very intriguing discussion with Jerry Summers, and I hope you've been uplifted, encouraged.
Already did my time. I paid for my crime.
Changes are coming, my friends.
Already did my time. I paid for my crime. I was a drug dealer, sold more drugs than Superfly, but I never got high on my own supply. I'm not proud of what I had to do. That's why I'm telling my story to you and you. I had to repent. I must admit, I was doing all kind of stupid shit. Now sit back and think it over since I've gotten older. The life I used to live, I wouldn't do it again. I was young and dumb, my brain was so numb. I was a real Forrest Gump, but I was nobody's chump. Me and Billy the Kid had a lot in common. I was the real Terminator, much meaner than Arnold Schwarzenegger. I'd chew you up and spit you out like a real alligator, especially all you haters.
The opening statements are going on right now. He could be facing life in prison. Prison.
Already did my time, paid for my crime. Already did my time. Already did my time, paid for my crime. Already did my time. Pay for my crime, pay for my crime, pay for my crime, pay for my crime. Already did my time, I paid for my crime. Already did my time, I paid for my crime. I'm trying to get this felony off my back so I can get my life on track and have the right to vote and live like an ordinary citizen again. This is my message to all of my friends in the pen, statewide, worldwide. There was not a man I couldn't beat. I was good with my hands and very quick on my feet. I was swimming in women. I had girls all over the street. I was getting money. Life was so sweet. Now things have changed. The whole game has been rearranged. I'm a changed man. Don't need no gun in my hand. It ain't about being no gangster. Life is too short to spend it all in jail. Trying to cope with this living hell. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime.